Welcome to the Farrell Sports Business Podcast. This week, the podcast is going to talk about podcasts. These are some of my favorite sports business podcasts out there, and why. It's not exhaustive. There's so many out there, but I usually listen to podcasts while I'm walking the dog, and you can only walk the dog so much in life. And also, for those of you watching on YouTube, you may notice that I'm testing out a new studio setup, and look, let me know what you think. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, iHeart, any of those traditional podcasty places, pop on over to YouTube and give it a peek and give me some feedback and what you think of the new studio. So let's jump in and break down some of the best sports business podcasts out there. This is a fun topic to jump into because I'm actually a big admirer of a lot of people's work in sports business podcasting. Walking the dog, that's my usual go-to, sometimes in the car. So there's some podcasts that I've learned a lot from that I continue to listen to today that have actually provided some inspiration for this sports business podcast. And so I wanted to get into it and give a shout out to some people doing some great work. This is not a ranked list, but should be a fun one to jump into. Starting out is the Sporticast. This is a podcast by Sportico, the online publication that covers the business of sports. The Sporticast podcast, I think, is actually one of the best ones. It's Scott Soshnick and Eben Novy-Williams, and it really comes from a journalistic background and covering the business of sports, main personalities. They have a lot of fun on this podcast as well. I will admit sometimes it gets really, really campy, and I could maybe dial that down a little bit. But honestly, this is just one of those best. It's about 30 minutes plus or minus, and occasional guests, but they'll take a topic. Most recently was about women's sports and biggest earners in women's sports, and they just really take a topic and do it justice. And it really comes from a deep reporting and factual background. And so this is actually one of my go-to and my favorites, and I look for the new update whenever it comes out. There are two Sports Business Journal podcasts that I'm going to somewhat lump together for this list. The first is the Sports Business Buzzcast. This is a 5-day-a-week business day podcast, usually about 10 minutes or so, and is just chock full of information. And Abe Madcore is usually the host, but they rotate it around when he's traveling. And this is a headlines, meat and potatoes type of a podcast. And if you're interested in sports or work in the sports business, this is just a go-to and a staple for everyday, weekday listening. It's really just straight to the point, headline and news driven. The other sports business podcast is the Sports Media Podcast. And this is also a really good one and gets into what's happening in the media, television consumption, online consumption, guest driven. It works in a lot of really good voices into the mix. It's very data driven and TV driven, but I think it provides a good insight into what's performing from a television and viewing perspective that gives you an idea of really the pulse of what's happening in sports in America. So the combination of these two, I think, are really good. 3 is the Sports Media Podcast with Richard Deitsch. This one is excellent. Richard really comes from a journalistic background, former SI writer, now writes for The Athletic, has been doing media podcasting and media coverage online, very heavy on X, formerly Twitter, has recently transferred over and does a lot of the same work on Blue Sky. But Richard really looks at what's going on in the sports media landscape. NBA and TNT and ESPN renewals, what's happening with talent, really dove in analyzing how Tom Brady was doing in his first, debut broadcast, coming, now admittedly, I care less a little about Tom Brady's doing, but it's important and is actually a driver of what's going on in the sports media landscape. Great guess. And then he will even go off on some topics that most sports entities don't cover all that well. He's heavy into women's basketball, does phenomenal justice to women's sports in general. And then we'll pop an episode of, guests like looking at the great sports writing of the past year. So also one of my staples and go-to podcasts. 4 is Front Office Sports Today. Now, that one's in a little bit of a transition. They have really just dialed that back and announced that they're going to go through a format change and reintroduce the Front Office Sports Today podcast. But I would put that one up there with its host, Owen Poindexter, as really just as good in the same level as what Sports Business Journal does. Tends to go a little bit deeper. Longer episodes daily with guests, brings in some of its writers for Q&A who write for Front Office Sports in general. And so quality product already. It's going through a transition and going to be repackaged, and we just don't know what that's going to be quite yet, but looking forward to this one. 5 is Navigating Sports Business. This comes from the media and research firm Navigant. Interview-driven shows, a lot of them clients, and really Navigant does such great work in the sports research landscape that their guests are always great and natural, and many of them tend to be clients, which is also great, but the high-quality interview show. Next is the SportsTravel Podcast. SportsTravel, if you think about it, not just the national and, professional leagues, but even down to youth travel, is a $52 billion industry. And Sports Travel Magazine, which started out as print publication, online publication, the editor and host of the podcast is Jason Gewirtz. And he just always has his finger on the pulse of what's happening in youth sports, how that impacts the economy of sports, and is never really an X's and O's who beat who type publication, but really looks at what events are going to different cities, what's the economic impact when an event comes to a city. It's just a unique angle, and there's nobody better and more knowledgeable of the sports industry than Jason Gewirtz. The Petcash Pod with Andrew Petcash. This is a really good one that tends to go toward entrepreneurs, startups, technology, or even companies that are a little more advanced but are very innovative. One of the most recent one is with the CEO of 5-Iron Golf, and talking about really the sportainment industry and learnings and how 5-Iron Golf is trying to improve and differentiate. So it takes really interesting angles that come from an investment, an entrepreneur and technology type angle. And I've just always been impressed with Andrew as a host. He never makes it about him. He doesn't interrupt his guests. He asks short questions and really makes the guest the star of the show, as it should be in an interview show. And so it was an early inspiration for me of just how to run a podcast and interact with guests. And so I always love this one. Sports Business Radio with the host Brian Berger. That is just a staple, and there have been like 700 plus or more episodes. And Brian's been at this for so long and is such a pro that he gets A-list level guests to talk about sports business. And he's just a pro, and he's been doing this for so long and built up such a good following that it's always a really good and an insightful podcast on the sports business side. Number 9 is the Bloomberg Business of Sports. I have to admit I listened to this one less. This one feels like a traditional radio broadcast in many ways, but it's coming from Bloomberg, so rooted in its journalistic chops, very data-driven, very finance-driven, always professional, And this one's just going to feel a little bit more like a traditional radio news broadcast, but also really, really good stuff and takes a financial lean to a lot of its topics. Then there's the Sports Management Podcast. The host is Marcus Phillipson, and this one's done out of Europe and tends to have a much more global feel to it in terms of guests and topics, getting into football or soccer or other European sports, and even academia with academic leaders and professors. Marcus was kind enough to invite me to it. But it's just a steady one and always out there, and he does a great job promoting it with clips on TikTok. Those are my key ones. There are a couple others that I admit I just haven't spent as much time with. There's the Unofficial Partner Podcast. I need to dive into that one. There's Sports Geek with Sean Callanan. I haven't really spent time with that. Again, there's only so much dog walking you can do in life. I'm sure I've missed something. If I do, let me know. And in the meantime, thanks for listening to the Farrell Sports Business Podcast.